All right, so this is going to be my lecture on modernism. It'll be short, and there'll be some examples in there that you can go either come back and read or go find on your own, but I just put them in there as excerpts so you would know what to go look for. So modernism started in the early 1900s. 1900 to 1965 is what we usually consider to be the modernist period. The history behind it is that around the turn of the century, a number of historical things happened, big shocks to the system of society that really started pushing people away from the super-ordered Victorian way. Victorians really believed in order and society and following sort of the institutions. And this is a real big departure in modernism. Modernism is very much about the individual and a distrust of the organizations and the society that individual lives in. The three major shocks were, first off, World War I. Although for us this is history and it doesn't seem that uncommon to have a thing like a world war. In fact, in our history there's two of them. To these people at this time, this is a brand new concept. The entire world can be at war and it can be mechanized enough to kill each other in very ghastly and very efficient ways, which is number two, technological advances. Just like with any kind of technological jumps, wars tend to jump technology forward. And so after the industrialization of, you know, England and then the United States, and then that even faster advancement through, through war, we see a big mechanization of both countries. And this creates a level of disconnect in people. Think about you and your cell phone and how you currently hear people say no one ever talks to each other anymore, no one is really involved anymore, and all of these sort of evils of technology. Well, the same thing happened when the car and the tractor and the teletype were invented. And then the last thing is World War II. Not far after 1918, we have in the 1930s World War II. And so by the time we get here, this disillusionment from World War I is really solidified by World War II, and the atrocities and horrors that people see in the modern world have really pushed them to a place of despair and disbelief. So what does that look like in literature? Well, first thing, it's marked by a strong and intentional break with tradition. This break includes a strong reaction against established religious, political, and social views. So this is in America we call them the lost generation, people who just don't think anything matters anymore. There's nothing to believe in and no one to trust. Belief of the world is created in the act of perceiving it. That is, the world is what we say it is. So this sounds pretty out there and sort of existential or about existence, and it kind of is, but in a more definitive way, you see it through the idea that the individual's perception is much more important than what they're being told. And so with that, you don't focus so heavily on what an objective truth is, but you focus on what my view of the truth is, which brings us to that. There is no such thing as absolute truth. All things are relative. Now, they wouldn't fight necessarily on things like, color or is this grass or is it gravel? It would be more things along the lines of how one interprets the world. And really you see it in the idea that the individual's interpretation and feelings outweigh what is. So no connection with history or institutions. Their experiences out of alienation, loss, and despair. Think about kind of the current run of dystopian literature, Hunger Games, Divergent, the idea that one has been failed by the society they live in. This is really where it comes from. Before this there was some extent of that, but it really wasn't as prevalent as after the modernist period, where after being caught in these world wars and being sent off to kill soldiers from other countries that you didn't really have anything against, it was very hard for people to come back and not say, I've been duped by the society that I felt invested in, and this is where we get this kind of writing. Our main characters don't have an association with their society. They feel lost and alone. And then the champion of the individual and the celebration of inner strength. So this is where we really get the hero that can do it because of the fortitude of themselves. You know, the Odysseus that we saw in the Odyssey becomes the underdog in the modern world, somebody who is not doing it because they're being propped up by society, but almost doing it in lieu of any help, in spite of society. And so this is what we talk about. We're really focusing on a main character, an individual. And so this is also why you see a lot of first-person narration start to come in, because we don't want someone telling someone else's story. We want a person telling their own story. Also, life is unordered, and because of that lack of order, narration takes a less linear standpoint. So you can jump around a lot. For those of you who've read The Color Purple, you see that in there where we jump around in time a little bit with Celie, but we also have Nettie's narrative dropped in the middle of it. We have things that we find out about Shug and we find out about Albert that are not necessarily in the order of when they happen, but of just how they're told. And so this is an illustration that, you know, life is unordered, and we don't always know everything when we need to, and things don't happen when they're supposed to. And then concern with the subconscious. And so what this means is internal motivations. What do we do because of that we don't even know about? What is influencing us or pushing us in a direction that even we're unaware of? You know, so what are the habits that are created by the things that happen when we're little? So again, going back to The Color Purple, what happens to Celie that makes her who she is emotionally, that she then has to overcome to change that, because those decisions are subconscious. She doesn't consciously think about being who she is. It's just simply ingrained in her based on her abuse. Okay, so modernism was a little different in different places. So British modernism, the first one we're going to talk about, has examples of somebody like James Joyce, and his most experimental and famous work, Ulysses, completely abandons generally accepted notions of plot, setting, and characters. So if you go back and read this, you're going to find that it makes no sense whatsoever, and that's not fair. To some extent it does, but it's not what you would consider a classic narrative. Also, you'll see Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier, which examines the negative effects of war. So before, where you might have had more positive things, you know, Walt Whitman's Oh Captain, My Captain, where he's talking about an assassination and he's sad, but it still sounds positive. No more here. It is very bare and very true to the feelings of the person, that they are suffering because of this. Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, and big one on what's called stream of consciousness. And what this means is that the story is being told with almost with no breaks and no edits. It is just as it is poured out onto the page, that's how the story exists. Now, in American modernism, we have what's called the lost generation. American writers in the 20s, and they first brought the modernism to the United States. They went overseas to be in the war, and after witnessing what happened in the war, they came back and were really affected by the idea that the American dream wasn't real anymore. They were, at that time, what they would call shell shock, we now call PTSD. They struggled to keep jobs. They struggled to get over what they had seen, and so they were sort of abandoned by their society as not being able to cope, and so therefore they were lesser men and unworthy of any kind of help or support. And so you start to see this in our writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald. Most of you probably read Gatsby with Mrs. Kumple, sorry, and you know it's a book about the loss of the American dream. That even though Gatsby gets everything that he thinks he wants, it's all an attempt to gain this sort of fulfillment that none of it will ever give him. And so the material gains of the American dream are just hollow, and that tells us that it doesn't really exist. So that, in a nutshell, is what modernism is, and those are the kinds of, and all of the things listed prior to this and here are going to be the things that you go look for when discussing a modernist piece. Now, on the AP test, it might say some of ask you about the effects of modernism, how a particular piece illustrates modernism or another literary period. These are the things you'd be looking for. Other than that, as we do analysis, these are the things that you want to start with. After this, you can then look at it as an individual piece, but this is a good shorthand for what a lot of modernist pieces will have.